In the year of 1975 of the Third Age, the Kingdom of Angmar was destroyed by the combined forces of Gondor and its allies. Having lasted for a little under 700 years, Angmar was short-lived when compared to the long histories of elves and men, but that didn't matter. It had achieved its goal of destroying Arnor so utterly that it wouldn't rise again for the rest of the Third Age. After its destruction, the land of Angmar remained silent, but given how successful it was in the past, why did Sauron never attempt to reclaim Angmar? Funnily enough, this exact concept has been explored in several adaptations of Tolkien's work. The base game of The Lord of the Rings Online is called Shadows of Angmar, and explores the idea of a newly arisen Angmar once again threatening the lands of the North during the War of the Ring. There's also the video game War in the North, where the main antagonist is a black Númenórean who has taken up residence in the old fortress of Khand Dûm. And Angmar appears in numerous player modifications for numerous games, so obviously it's a popular concept. This isn't entirely fanfiction though. While Angmar was never reoccupied by Sauron's forces, there was a certain individual who feared it would happen, and of course that individual was Gandalf, who was worried that Sauron would forge an alliance with Smaug while he occupied Erebor, and that would allow him to send forces through the north to reoccupy Angmar, and from Angmar he would be able to launch easy attacks on Rivendell and Lothlórien. Unfortunately, our view of Sauron's perspective is limited, so we're unsure whether there was any truth to Gandalf's fears. One thing to consider is that during Smaug's 170-year-long occupation of Erebor, Sauron never did make a move to reoccupy Angmar. And maybe that's because reoccupying Angmar would not have been easy for Sauron. In fact, it would have been incredibly difficult. When the Witch King first arrived in Angmar in 1300, he had a few advantages. He had a clear plan that was very much worth executing: destroy the Dunedain of Arnor, who, I might add, were already doing a decent job of that themselves. There was also men living in Angmar who were hostile to Arnor, as well as a growing population of orcs in the nearby Misty Mountains, and a population of hillmen in Rhudaur who were keen to overthrow their Dunedain overlords. So the Witch King already had the necessary armies in waiting. All they needed was a proper commander. And lastly, the Witch King's enemies were largely blind to his presence until it was too late. But at the end of the Third Age, Middle-earth is a vastly different place. If Sauron wants to commit to a daring venture such as reoccupying Angmar, he needs a good reason to do so, and Gandalf sort of provided one, to attack Rivendell and Lothlórien. I say sort of because, well, it's not really a good reason. Sauron can attack Lothlórien just fine from Dol Guldur, and as for Rivendell, whilst I'm sure Sauron would love to see it burn, it isn't really a place of major strategic importance from a military perspective. It's far from the front lines, and it has relatively few people living there. As for the rest of Eriador, Sauron is either ignorant of it, such as the Shire, it's unimportant, such as Bree, or it's too far away to matter, such as Lindon or the Blue Mountains. What I'm saying is that these places aren't worth the risk for Sauron. And make no mistake, it is a risk. I mentioned before that in the past, there was power in Angmar that was just waiting for a certain someone to harness it. That's just not the case late in the Third Age. When Angmar was destroyed, its people were either wiped out or driven away, and there's no evidence to suggest that they ever recovered. The same can be said for the Hillmen of Rhudaur, and as for the Orcs of the Misty Mountains, they too came close to annihilation during the late Third Age. So Angmar and the neighbouring lands are pretty much deserted, and if Sauron wants to reoccupy it, he would have to send his own forces, and they would have to start from square one. This wouldn't be easy either. If Sauron wanted to send forces to Angmar, they would have to trek through the northern lands either through or above Mirkwood, or they would have to pass through the inhospitable frozen wastes of Forodwaith. The latter would be almost impossible, especially if you're sending an army, and as for the former, Sauron only had a short window of time where he could send forces through the north without running into major trouble, and that was during Smaug's occupation of Erebor from 2770 to 2941, a period where Sauron is still intent on keeping his identity a secret, clearly not entirely confident in his own power just yet. Prior to that, the Dwarves and their Northmen allies controlled the north, having major holdings at Erebor, the Grey Mountains, the Iron Hills, and the lands around Dale. So for most of the late Third Age, the north was firmly held against Sauron, and moving troops to a location as distant as Angmar would be incredibly difficult. But let's say, for argument's sake, that Sauron, against the odds, did manage to get some of his troops to Angmar. what would they then be able to achieve? The answer, probably not much. Unlike in the past, the Free Peoples were now very much awake to Sauron's movements, and were willing to make preemptive strikes, such as the White Council did upon Dol Guldur in 2941 and Gondor's attack on Umbar in 2980. If some of Sauron's forces managed to reclaim Angmar, they probably wouldn't even be there long until they were attacked by elves from Rivendell, Lothlorien, and possibly Lindon, and of course the ever-watchful Dunedain Rangers. This wouldn't be a large army by any stretch of the imagination, but it doesn't need to be. Sauron's forces are in a ruined, deserted land, far from help, and fighting foes far superior to them. It's very likely that they would all die. So to summarise, Sauron never reclaimed Angmar because he had little reason to, and because the risk factor was just too high. There were no targets in the north that were vital to Sauron's war effort against the Free Peoples. Angmar had been utterly destroyed in the past, and any attempts to rebuild it would have to start from scratch. The north was not controlled by Sauron's forces for much of the late Third Age, meaning it would be difficult to get troops there, and any attempt to rebuild Angmar would draw unwanted attention. To put it bluntly, reclaiming Angmar would not have been worth the effort. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. On another note, I just hit 6,000 subscribers, so thank you to everyone, both old subscribers and new. I really appreciate your continued support, and for being an audience to something I'm so passionate about. Cheers, farewell, and remember, just because something worked in the past, it doesn't mean it will work again. Unless it's Call of Duty, that will probably just work forever.